Hello, everyone, and welcome to Affirmation, a podcast by Afrometrics, which you can find online at afrometrics.org. The purpose of this podcast is to highlight research about people of African descent. Before we started recording, I was talking to Ms. Robinson about why we started this podcast or started doing these interviews, and it's particularly because so much good research, so much good scholarship that could be useful to people of African descent is in between the pages of articles and journal articles, published in journal articles, and not necessarily in books. But I suspect that Ms. Robinson will have books on the way in her professional future. So those are important as well. But just to highlight scholars who have dedicated to studying and improving the lives of people of African descent or in some way, shape, or form. And I'm Siri McDougall from Afrometrics, and today we're going to be discussing a great study that was conducted by and also written and published by Sekani Robinson, and it's called Black Ballerinas, the Management of Emotional and Aesthetic Labor. Sekani Robinson is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's completed a master's degree at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I completed a Bachelor's of Arts at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. She writes on racial, gendered, and cultural foundations and inequalities within creative spaces, work and occupations, aesthetic and emotional labor, and elites. Her current research focuses on Black women's experiences in ballet. Sekani currently works with a nonprofit organization called Brown Girls Do Ballet and teaches race and ballet history for American Ballet Theater's Summer Intensive, which focuses on developing well-rounded dancers through exposure to a wide variety of disciplines with an emphasis on classical ballet technique. I think that Ms. Robinson, who is soon to be Dr. Robinson, is going to be a major scholar in the area of creative production, Black aesthetics, and aesthetics in general, and the experiences of Black ballerinas, and who knows what other topics in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah. And before we begin with some of those questions about your work, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from?
Yeah, so I'm from California. Specifically, I was born in San Diego. I lived in LA for a long time, so that's where I'm currently at. I am a doctoral student at UC Santa Barbara, and I'm a sociology major. I typically focus on race, gender, work, like inequality and elite culture, and then, of course, like performance and sports.
Can you say a little bit about how you developed your interests in ballet?
Yeah. So I did ballet forever. I started when I was 3 years old, and I did it like off and on as I was like growing up. So I did other sports. I did softball, I did cheerleading, but I kind of kept going, and I did different forms of dance, but I kept going back to ballet. So in high school, I kind of more so gravitated that. At my high school, it was very ballet based, so I did more ballet than any other style dance. Sometimes, of course, I did gravitate towards like contemporary dance after a while, which I can explain why I gravitated towards that a little later. It will make more sense. And then I also did like hip hop on and off, but it was always the core was ballet, and so that's kind of how it happened. I just always been fascinated. I love the challenge. So
Wow. Yeah. And one of the things that made me that I was interested in reading this article is because my sister was a ballerina and is still a ballerina, and so is my niece. And we used it was a family outing we would have to go see her do the dance of the she was in the dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy in the Nutcracker.
hmm
So we had it, and it was a different. I remember it being a different cultural experience because our parents had said that we had to be on. Maybe it was about me. I don't know. I don't know if it was about me being on good behavior, but we could not react in the Chicago symphony orchestra. It's like the auditorium they had there when she came out, the way that we would want to.
Yes,
But
it
uh,
is.
but yeah, she was. It was excellent, and that was mentioned by a lot of your interview interviewees in your study, the Nutcracker. So that was very nostalgic to read about on a personal level. I'll ask you this question about later, but I want to ask a little bit about what contributed to your resilience of staying in ballet based on some of the things that your interviewees said a little bit later. But what inspired you to conduct this study of Black women's unique experiences as ballerinas?
Yeah. So when I first started, I was always looking for dancers that looked like me. And so in middle school, I was looking for one, but I only found one, but she was retired and I couldn't find any information about her. And so then fast forward to high school for my senior project, I had to do this project kind of prepping us for if we wanted to dance in the future. And I was still like, I need to find a Black ballet dancer. There's no way that there's not one in the United States that I could find. And so I remember I was Googling one and Misty Copeland popped up at that moment. And so I instantly became so into her and followed her career. So fast forward to 2000, I was just always checking on her and looking her up. And in 2015, it was my junior year or my third year in undergrad. And I was starting this conversation of thinking about going to grad school or anything like that. And so at that moment, Misty had just became principal dancer. And I remember I was so excited. Like you would have thought, honestly, it was me that became principal. I was just so excited for her. And this conversation of race and ballet started to really kind of barely touch the surface. So at this moment, this is when we started to hear that there were former Black dancers, that they were starting to come out the woodworks and kind of talking a little, but they weren't really given platforms. Similar to like the platform that Misty had. And so that's when I went to my advisor and I was like, I think I want to write my plan for grad school. I want to write about Black ballet dancers. I think I had never heard of any my entire life growing up. And I'm like, I think this moment right now with Misty Copeland is so iconic. And I think this conversation of race and ballet is really going to take the forefront pretty soon. It's finally going to happen in ballet, which for the longest, it was never a conversation. And so I decided to do my dissertation on it. And the cool thing that happened is as the time happened, this is when this conversation is coming full front at this point and no one's hiding it. Misty became very vocal about this race and ballet. So me starting this research and this conversation started happening right at the same time.
Wow. And does your experience with finding Black ballet dancers, instructors, and models, is that related to? Does that have any relationship to why you currently work with the nonprofit organization Brown Girls Do Ballet? Does your involvement in that relate to your own experience in any way?
Yeah, so when I kind of came across Brown Girls Do Ballet at the very beginning when they were first starting as well, and I remember I was so excited. I saw it on social media, which is like that's kind of how it kind of started actually, and yeah, so it was for me, it was like it was so cool to see all these pictures of these Black dancers, either, like younger dancers getting like coming up, and then starting to see some of the older dancers. And it was something I always wish I had. I was like, well, I wish, like if I would have seen, Black dancers, Black ballet dancers, I think it would have changed my approach, which is kind of goes into like why I ended up gravitating more towards modern dance because I didn't see the representation in ballet. So I was just like, okay, well, maybe as one thing that I kind of found in my findings, which is what happened to me, is there were a lot of Black dancers are geared and kind of, yeah, geared towards modern dance and like out of ballet. They're at least geared out of ballet. And that's what happened to me. But it made sense at the moment when it was happening. As my teacher was like, you should do modern dance, you should focus on modern dance. I'm like, okay, well, that's where I'm seeing these dancers at. Like, I saw a few Alvin Ailey performances. So I was just like, okay, so that's where they are. So this is the direction I must be going, not realizing that until I started doing this work that was a form of pushing out Black
Mm.
dancers from from ballet.
Okay. And that's kind of the expectation, and the Black girls were being funneled into that.
Yes,
Interesting.
yeah, I started learning that as I was interviewing. A lot of them were like, yeah, my teacher just started pushing modern dance or hip hop. And as I kept hearing this, I'm like, wait, this happened to me. So this must be a trend, or this must be, something that reoccurs, a reoccurring experience that I kept experiencing. So
Yeah. And I can't help but ask this question. In your literature review, the first part of your kind of your study, before you start getting into the results of your study on the experiences of Black ballerinas, you kind of give a history of Black people's experience in ballet, and you make one remark, and it's not that this is not this was not the purpose of your study, but it jumped out to me. But you talked about how ballet was influenced by stolen and appropriated Black culture, um, which I think we can say, like so many other cultural products. So this is something that I believe not many people are familiar with, and it wasn't the purpose of your study, but you referenced it. So I wonder if you could expand on this point and perhaps give an example or two.
yeah, so American ballet specifically was heavily, like, not heavily, but yeah, pretty heavily influenced by a lot of Black icons and idioms. So technically, a lot of people say like George Balanchine is like the founder of American ballet, which is also ironic because prior to George Balanchine coming to the United States around 1934, a lot of Black culture aligning with the Harlem Renaissance, they were starting this classical Black era. And so this is when we're starting to see a lot of Black ballet schools being formed in the 1920s. But of course, that's not told when we're hearing history, when we're talking about history or even ballet history. A lot of times this part gets excluded. But this was already forming before George Balanchine came and created New York City Ballet and School of American Ballet. So these big ballet schools that are honestly considered one of the top companies and schools in the world before they were formed. And so George Balanchine specifically, he worked with a lot of Black choreographers and dancers. So a few are like Catherine Dunham. She is a big icon in the dance world. He worked with her. He also worked a lot in Broadway, where he met like the Nicholas brothers, if anyone's familiar with them. So, and what he got is inspired by a lot of the dance styles. So there's a style called the cakewalk, and Brenda Dixon Gottschalk she has a book out that talks a lot about the similar movements and styles that were inspired by Black culture and Black idioms, in which are put into Balanchine's dance style. And so with ballet, there's a few different dance styles that they're not that much different from each other. So you'll have like a Russian style, like the Vanguard style, a style more that the French kind of use more so. And then you have like Balanchine style, and Balanchine style is probably the most unique, that you can tell like, okay, you're trained Balanchine style. And that is because it's influenced by a lot of Black styles of dance that came before, especially incorporating the hips a lot. So that's kind of, then of course, these things aren't told when we're hearing about the history of dance. We're just talking about, oh, George Balanchine came, ballet started, he created this style, but we're not talking about the influence. And again, what happened before George Balanchine came to the United States.
Wow, thank you for answering that question, because I think it's a kind of a pattern, a historical pattern when it comes to Black culture, cultural products, and cultural influence that a lot of people may not be surprised by, but I think may not know that history when it comes to to ballet. So appreciate that. There were two ideas that you talk about in this study that I think it might help to explain before you talk about the results. And you talk about emotional and aesthetic labor. So more specifically, you talk about emotional and aesthetic experience in ballet. So can you take some time to explain these two concepts and the relationship between the two of them, emotional and aesthetic? Because you say that you talk about, yes, they're different, but they have a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, definitely. So, emotional labor came by Arlie Hochschild around in her book, The Managed Heart, that came out in 1983. And so, what she kind of talks about is the management of feeling and like creating this public observation and controlling your facial and body display when you're in front of people, despite how you can actually be feeling internally. And so that was kind of that came out first, and that was the groundwork for any type of emotional and a lot of scholarship on just emotions and feelings. And so, building on emotional labor, then you had aesthetic labor, which Warhurst, Nixon, and Witts kind of came out in the early 2000s. And so, this talked about actual, like physical, just your looks in general. So, your looks and how you present yourself and the style. And so, finding a way to categorize aesthetic labor of having this particular style that fits the service within for like whoever wherever they're working. So it's kind of like with Hollister and Abercrombie and Urban Outfitters, they have a particular look that they want. They want their employees to look a particular way. Hooters is another place they want a particular look. And so these kind of become really prominent in specifically like modeling and like and ballet specifically because they want you to have this look. Now what I kind of talk about how they go to hand in hand is how it's kind of like the mind body experience in which these two go together, specifically with race. So, given that the look for ballet is very heavily influenced by Eurocentric ideals of beauty, for a lot of Black women, they just don't fit this look. And so what happens is these Black women are trying to navigate how to kind of get as close to the look as they need to. So this hegemonic idea of what they consider beauty, how to get this idea. But in the process, as they're dealing with all this discrimination and being told that you don't have the look or not being able to actually complete the look by little things of not having, well, little things that end up being big things, like you don't have the right point shoes or you don't have the right tights. And then what you realize is you're trying to navigate this, but inside it could be bothering you. And this is where emotional labor comes in. It could be bothering, but you're trying to find a way to present yourself still and not look, again, fit a category or a stereotype of looking like this angry Black woman or just looking unhappy. You still have to present this look despite feeling like, this place isn't for me, or I can't achieve this. This look is not for you. So trying to find that balance.
Wow. And I think that my next question, I think you might have addressed some of it already, but I'll ask just in case you want to add some more. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your study that modeling, athletics, and ballet are occupations that have specific requirements about appearance for everyone, especially Black women. And can you say more about that? And I think you already started, but
Yeah. So,
yeah.
yeah, just like for athletes, and I think it kind of comes in very specific for models and dancers, but they have to maintain this look. They have to have this athletic, fit appeal. Their body matters. How they present themselves matters. And so, what happens in these spaces? So, while you're trying to fit this look, a lot of times this look isn't, again, it's not catered towards you, or it's criticized you just because of racial. I mean, if you look at Serena Williams, she gets so much criticism all the time for the way her body looks, and that's actually something that was similar for Misty Copeland. Like, she got a lot of criticism because she looked too muscular, or and then the conversation of looking manly because you're so muscular comes into play. And that's when you're looking at, okay, well, this look then isn't for you, because isn't catered towards Black women, because they can't, you have to look fit but not too fit. And who's considered too fit and who's not, because a lot of times, of course, like I said, Serena Williams is always quick to be called too muscular, but someone else could be just as muscular, but they don't get that term, or they're not called a man or things like that. So it's trying to find this balance of you have to present your body in a certain way in these spaces. I kind of call them like desirable, like occupations, because they're typically like these high ranking occupations that people always aspire to be, but they only take so few. And so you're required to look this way, but a lot of times, like I said, for Black women, it backfires on them, or they get marginalized or put into these controlling images.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really made me want to look at this at this study, in addition to just the title itself, was that you did focus specifically on Black women, and I think it's clear why, and what you just explained, because I've seen a few graduate students who will be interested, and they'll say that I'm interested in studying the experiences of Black women in fill in the blank different area, and then when they come back, I've seen that they have changed their topic to women or women of color. I'm like, well, what happened? And they'll say that, well, there was some pressure to study women of color. And I see you nodding your head. Is that
Yeah.
a experience
Yes,
you've heard
that
before?
definitely, yeah, that definitely and
Yeah.
continuously happened to me. I had professors, even my committee was like, well, do you want to open it up? And maybe you should look at different, women from different races and ethnicities. And I went back and forth about it, but I kept saying no because Black women, specifically their experience, is very unique. Like, for other races and ethnicities, it depends. So colorism plays, of course, which plays into the Black community, but it depended heavily on colorism when it came to other races. But I was like, Black women across the board, it didn't matter. They faced a very similar experience. So I kept going back like, no, I don't want to open it up. I just wanted Black women. I've also had questions about Black men. And I was like, well, my plan is I later on for my dissertation, there was going to be a short piece, given that, again, the focus is still on Black women. But for Black men, their experience was a little different because although they are still stereotyped and typecasted, it was to their benefit. So it's like, okay, well, Black men have this idea of being hyper masculine and strong. And so for a lot of Black men, that's why they get hired, opposed to Black women. For the longest, it was the ratio for men to women in ballet was like 8-1. And so the number is still always higher for Black men than it is for Black women. And so that's why I wanted to focus on Black women. So I went back and forth with people, but I was very adamant like, no, we need to just talk about Black women. I think we never do. And of course, like many people, we always end up having to include everyone, which isn't bad, but you lose the story and the focus, which again, for me, is Black women.
Yeah, I mean, and you saw variation within the group of 15, the 15 Black ballerinas that you looked at. You saw a variation in thought. Now, if you had included a lot of, it included these different demographics, would you have been able to capture that? And I think that what you said is important. I hate to get on my stool here, but like I hope that a lot of graduate students who are listening hear this and say, hey, stick to your guns. That Black people or whatever segment of Black people that you want to look at are worthy of study and are worthy of a singular focus. It doesn't mean that you're rejecting any other demographic, but they're worthy of study. And you can bring in other experiences and do compare and contrast, etc. But it's important to have that singular focus. And you look specifically at 15 Black ballerinas who you interviewed for your study. And one thing that stood out to me was that they didn't want you to use the pseudonyms. And I know that that's just one sentence. Like that's one sentence out of an entire page. But that, again, that's something that stood out to me. They didn't want you to use pseudonyms. They didn't want you to for people who don't know, they didn't want you to hide or protect their identity. They wanted people to know who they were and they wanted to stand by what they said. And I just wanted to ask you what participating in this study meant to these women. Did they even speak to that? They may not have, I don't know, but did they express to you at any point what it meant for them to participate in this study?
Yes. So actually, as I went through this interview and hearing like how important this was for a lot of these dancers and former dancers, that's actually the reason why I went back and was like, well, I mean, do you want a pseudonym? I just assumed automatically I was going to give pseudonyms. So I kind of, I let them know that like of course my goal is to protect them, went through protocol, but as they kept saying their stories and said how important it was. And for a lot of my interviewees, participants, they were just like, thank you for reaching out to me and letting me share my story. Like no one has ever asked me to share my story before. So I knew it meant a lot to them. And again, giving from where I came from, like coming from the space I came from where I didn't know any, I'm like, no, these stories are valid and they're important. They're important to share. So another, like the next Black girl that's reading this, or, someone that picks this up, they can be like, oh, well, like there are these dancers, so that they can also look into them, or they just know who they are. I do with some of the current dancers, which is also what I'm in the process with. I try and be more protective with them just because they're currently dancing. And so I think one thing that I kept getting backlash from when I was trying to get my article out is they wanted more information about the dancers. So they're like, well, how old are they, or what's this or that? And I was like, well, I can't give you that information if I'm giving out names, just to protect them from, like a lot of them still work in the ballet world and are dancing. So it's kind of similar to modeling. No one wants to know wants to tell their age. They want to get away with, being ambiguous as far as their age, just for, the way the occupation works. Everyone wants someone younger. So I wanted to be mindful of that and other information with them. But for them, it was very important to share their names. So I knew I wanted to give them that opportunity to share their names, but I wanted to be mindful, of course, to protect them with everything else.
Okay. To finally get to your results, I had so many other questions before we even got to your results, but one of the findings that you had was that Black women experience unique forms of marginalization and discrimination. And you describe how they have to alter their clothing to conform to white cultural standards. And you note that it wasn't until 2017 that even a few companies began making tights and shoes for women with darker complexions. And I want to ask you what impact this has on Black women and girls who are dancers and have to endure this kind of marginalization.
Yeah, so it's just this idea of racial fatigue. You're constantly being excluded from this space. So even as little as you can't walk into the you can't walk into like a dance store and just pick up tights. You can't just pick up point shoes. So if you're running late, you can't be like, Mom, can we just stop real quick and pick this up? Because not all companies, but a lot of companies, at least two, sometimes with practice and stuff, you want to have flesh colored tights. And the reason, and another reason why it's a big deal, just because as far as lines look for ballet, just to have this elongated physique and your legs look longer, and just as far as how it complements it, that having pink point shoes and tights do not complement darker skin tones as flesh does. And so that's why a lot of dancers advocate for wanting to wear flesh tone. And so for many before, now, like I said, they're starting to come out with point shoes and tights. But before, even when I was dancing, I know like we had to dye them. You had to dye your tights. So again, this is this added labor that people aren't thinking about. So aside from me not being able to just last minute grab tights or point shoes, I have to get these tights ahead of time. Then I have to dye my tights. So that takes time, and also finding the right color to dye them. So that's trial and error. It's also money that I'm also spending. So makeup is not cheap. Dye, you have to buy dye, which it could be cheaper, not depends what kind you use. But what happens with point shoes for a lot of these women is they have to do this thing called pancake them. And so that's taking the makeup and just painting it onto their point shoes to match their skin tones. Again, when you're in there, you can you could need to change your point shoes right away. But the idea of you having to paint them and then pancake them and then let it dry, just as simple as that. These are these added things of labor that these Black women have to endure that other women do not. And so this is a constant reminder, like, well, I can't even find tights and point shoes that match for me, or leotards. I share, some of the experiences that some of the dancers, when the costume that everyone, sometimes they change out depending on the person, the leotard under doesn't match the skin tone of the the darker skinned dancers. So for some companies, they just make you take it out. So these are constant reminders that this isn't a space for me. Um, like it's not designed to support me or to be inclusive to me. Hairstyles aren't designed to be inclusive. So all these things add up and create this racial fatigue that for many Black dancers they experience.
Thank you. And you also said that the women who you interviewed discussed being portrayed in ways that remarginalize them, as they were cast in roles consistent with racist and gendered and controlling images of Black women, such as the stereotype of the Black Jezebel, the mammy, the welfare recipient, and so forth. But you also talk about how the women, Black women, dance to express their agency and self-determination through resistance. And can you talk about how the women in your study resisted these attempts to marginalize or cast them in homogenizing ways? Can you talk about how they engaged in this resistance? It wasn't a major finding, but you did mention that it happens. Can you talk about how they do that?
Yeah, so just being in the space in general as a Black woman is already this form of resistance, just because given the stereotype and this inclusive idea of ballet, it's known to be predominantly and historically white. So for Black women to enter this space where ballet dancers are considered pure and elegant, and so, like have this mystical, like idea of femininity to them. Black women in here for a lot, the idea is that Black women come in and disrupt this idea because Black women can't be seen as pure or elegant. And so them being in space, in the space in general, creates this challenge, like challenging this ideal, and is gives them just their let alone space of trying to navigate the space. So when they're in there and they're presented with things that they don't agree with, which I talk about, like Deborah and how she deals with like trying to reject this role that the choreographer wanted to give her,
Yeah.
they're in this place, and this is where this whole emotional aesthetic labor comes back. They're in this place where they're trying to again advocate for themselves and get this form of agency, saying no, you're trying to put me in this image that I don't like, this stereotypical controlling image that I don't want to be in, but being mindful that again they had the way they approach the choreographer, this person of power, you have to figure out how to navigate that so you're not blackballed or, again, then placed in another category as being this angry Black woman or complicated to work with. So they're trying to put on this, while they deal with certain things that might make them angry, they put on this facade or this face, trying to find a way to politely say, well, I don't think I should do this, or trying to figure out when should they negotiate the roles that they're giving and when they're not.
Okay. And how did as a dancer and as a Black woman, how did you find ways to endure and transcend and persist these kinds of frustrations that your interviewees talked about?
That's a good question. I think it took me a while. It took me till high school till I could really like I felt like, okay, like you can put your foot down, it's okay. And luckily, I think just the family I came from gave me a strong sense of my identity. But again, you're in this place of, someone, you're dealing with someone of power. So, there's this hierarchy that's taking place. So I think just finding ways to be true to yourself and finding like, okay, well, if this doesn't work, then I have to step away, which is what happened with a lot of former dancers. A lot of them shared like they got to this point where they were like, I can't deal with this anymore. They didn't want to put up with it anymore, so they left. But in the process, it's just this, what's important to you. For a, a lot of us, it's like this is a passion for us. We really enjoy it, we enjoy the space, so you're figuring out like, okay, well, how can I navigate it without while still being in the space, just because I love it, so let me put that aside. Or for some people it's just a challenge. I had a lot of people that I interviewed, they were like, I was told at a young age I'll never be a professional dancer, so that motivated me to do it. One of them even shared like, I actually didn't want to go into ballet until someone said I couldn't, and so then I started really training and trying to focus and prove that I can be in this space. So it was between just wanting to challenge and prove that we can be in this space, and then just the love of it, trying to, like it's something like, well, I love it, so I want to figure out how I can bring my identity into a space that doesn't accept it.
Yeah. So wow, sounds like some do it as a form of resistance and for the love or mastery of the art. Uh, and then you mentioned family, and I hope that we end up getting to a point where we actually have families or parents listening to some of these interviews. But in the case that we do, how was your family supportive, or how can other families be supportive of Black girls who want to be ballerinas?
Yeah, I think my parents just set a great foundation of me and my identity. And they were very, I don't know if they knew because I was in ballet or not, but they were very adamant about making sure I accepted my body, which I think that's a big thing in ballet across the board. It doesn't matter who it is, body image is always the hard thing. But I think in conjunction to being okay with my identity, it made my experience how it was. And so I think when it comes to parents now, and the cool thing is, again, technology is so amazing, and then you have things like Brown Girls Do Ballet, and we're having this conversation of race in ballet right now. I think it's great for parents just to provide a network for their dancers, of being able to see a Black dancer and know that you can do this, this is the space. But of course, we'll still deal with this act of exclusion that happens in ballet, but just know you can still do it. Like, we can, there's ways to navigate it. We're hearing these stories of how these dancers are able to navigate it. So I think finding out how to navigate it and still stand behind what's important, your morals, and your identity and who you are. And I think trying to figure out how to push that and still keep it going is important. And I also think, just in general, the conversation that needs to happen with the administration needs to change, of course. Who we are letting into ballet, these gatekeepers, who they're letting in, who they're not. Again, little things like accepting like the flesh tone because it complements, the dancer. Trying to find this balance of conversation, I think it will go hand in hand with, for parents and for the administration.
Wow, I think you. So again, I think you addressed this, but I ask and as well. So when all is said and done, how do you think the information that you uncovered in this research can be used to improve the experiences of Black ballerinas?
Yeah. So, well, when I came into this project, my goal was to write this for little black girls that are looking for ballet dancers and wanting to hear their stories. That was one of my goals. And then my other goal was to write this for the administration, for anyone in these ballet companies, in order for us to figure out how can we make this change. And so my goal is to tell these stories so people can actually, because sometimes people are like, well, that doesn't happen because we're not hearing the stories. I want to be able to share these stories and these experiences so we know that they're there. We can't act like they're not there. And we can move into a different direction to figure out how we can restructure this mindset and this idea of what tradition is in ballet, because that's a lot of times how ballet is able to be so exclusive. It's like, well, we're going off a tradition, we don't want to change tradition. You have this idea of, again, ballet pink and um the ballet blanc, and like, it's historically been this way, so we can't change it. And it's like, okay, well, we're not trying to completely flip it upside down. What we want to do is make sure it's more inclusive. So how can we change, like, how can we alter something to make it more inclusive to Black dancers in the space and to support them so they can feel supported? That's the biggest thing. I think when people hear changing ballet or accepting Black, they feel like, I don't know why people think you have to just completely turn the idea of ballet upside down. That's not what needs to happen. Or you just need to all of a sudden admit anybody that's Black that wants to be. No, we want to still keep this idea of what it is, but how can we make it more inclusive is
Okay.
the goal. And so, yeah, I think it starts with addressing the administration and this idea of tradition.
And if those things are addressed, the issues with the dress code, the expectations of the dancer, the assigning of the casting, uh, the administrative changes, and the people who are the girls are exposed to, what impact do you think that those changes might have on Black girl ballerinas?
I think we will see more actually in the company. I don't want to say more just starting ballet, because it's ironic anytime, and this was also something I was interested at looking at. I always hear people like, oh, I used to do ballet, or I did ballet when I was little. So we can figure out how we can expand this trajectory for Black dancers, because somewhere throughout it, which again we're seeing through this research, the push out or just the lack of representation, we're seeing there's like a gap of people that go to studios and then who ends up in a company. And so I think this way we're able to see a better trajectory that happens within it, and hopefully see more Black dancers in major companies, and also just making the space more inclusive. Because for a lot of people, so it's funny when you mention like your parents were telling you to act right in here and the culture is so different, right? And so for a lot of people that's intimidating, so they don't come to the ballet. I know for the longest, until Misty Copeland became principal, a lot of Black people wouldn't have even seen a ballet. But the day she was performing her first principal role, the Met was covered with people that were Black and brown. And so again, it's this idea of representation. Once we start seeing it, and we can also, I think the cool thing of adding Black dancers and Black choreographers is, again, this diversity that we're going to see, this new style. Um, where you can always keep the classical ballets but put a different twist, which is what Balanchine did, and that's why he's so famous. So if you're adding different people, Black dancers and Black choreographers, that's what we're going to get. We're going to get this new style, this new twist, which makes these ballets iconic. Which again, like I said, Balanchine's his Nutcracker performance is one of the most renowned. Most people want to see that Nutcracker. Why? Because he had his own twist and he added this whole different shift of diversity to his Nutcracker. So with other ballets, we'll see the same thing.
Yeah, and that shift, as you mentioned, is influenced heavily by Black aesthetic. Okay.
Exactly.
And I do have a Black parent who has sent me a message to ask you that what would you say to a Black parent who is considering child's health because of that rejection, that marginalization, and that experience? And how do you, in the words of this parent, suggest that a Black parent help their child maintain their soul while in a space like the one that you have described in
Right.
some experiences?
Yeah, I think ballet is tricky in general. I have this conversation across the board with parents. I think one thing that ballet needs to do is talk about mental health, because even doesn't matter what color or race or ethnicity you are, mentally there's something that happens in ballet. But I think as far as racially, I think, unfortunately, it's kind of like having the same conversation, that Black conversation that you have with your kids when it comes to police and things like that. It's something that will kind of happen similar with ballet. It's this having this race talk, like, okay, in this space, you're going to experience this. And I think sometimes that's what you need to know. I think without knowing, like when I think for me, it was weird. And for a lot of dancers, you went in not realizing that this space wasn't designed for you and how to navigate it. So when you were presented with it, was just like, oh, like you're kind of, hit, you weren't prepared for it. So I think it's just having that conversation and keep checking in with your child, and then of course having boundaries, so to the point where it's, again, kind of how my participants are, they're navigating, negotiating things. So there were points where they're just like, no, I'm not doing this, like this isn't me, this is too out of my character, I don't want to be portrayed this way. So having this advocacy for yourself, and having, again, just these boundaries of when what's too far and what's not too far.
Okay. Yeah, because it's clear to me that you want to change the experiences, their experiences within it.
Right, right.
Right.
Right. Just because, again, it's just how Black dancers are treated. So I had just kind of finished this other article talking about how Black people aren't homogenous in general, but looking specifically at Black dancers, we're not all the same. So you will see some Black women with the right body type and some not. But the problem is we're all viewed the same. And so that's why we have similar experiences, right? So
Mm.
it's just one of this write-off thing, like, okay, well, all Black women don't have the right body type, but I'm like, you're assuming we all have the body type and we all don't have the same body type. Or another perception that people have is Black people can't afford to do ballet, so that's why we don't see so many Black dancers. And it's like, well, not every Black dancer came from the hood, like not every Black dancer is poor, like, or there's ways we can figure out how to pay for it. So it's just this idea that there's so much to us and we're all so diverse, but administration sees us the same. And so
Hmm.
that's why we're seeing this same, like we're seeing these similar things. So um I think, yeah, it's just one of those things, like we need preparing your kids that this is what you're going to face, whether it fits you or not. But I also think it's important to, of course, address that and just prepare your kids, because like I said, ballet in general, I hear so many mental health stories like across the board with body image for, again, and that's another thing, body image happens across the board. It's not just for Black women. A lot of different races and ethnicities deal with, trying to have the right body type and things of that nature. So it's just figuring out how to navigate. But like I said, race happens on top of that, because that's another form of exclusion.
Okay. What can people expect to see coming out for you? You have another study you're working on, it sounds like, right?
Yes, yes. So,
And
oh yeah, go ahead.
and again, what is that again?
Yeah, so I have another article that's looking on culture and race in ballet. So it's
Culture
looking
and
at
race.
kind of like the idea of this elite culture, and again, challenging this homogenous idea that Black dancers aren't the same. So we're seeing here, you're going to hear more of the stories of like a variety of these my participants, where they're talking about different, like they came from this background and attaining how they attained capital to even enter ballet, because ballet is so unique in the sense, and I guess kind of similar to any other athletic sport or something, but you can't just really go and be like, okay, well, I want to be a dancer, right? They take about 1%. So you have to start at a young age. You can't just like at 24 be like, okay, I want to be a ballet dancer. Your door kind of unfortunately has closed at that point. So a lot of dancers start at a young age, but what you don't know, and this is where culture, not everyone knows unless you have a certain culture or capital, is you have to go to summer intensive. So a lot of my participants were like, yeah, I
Mhm.
was wondering where all the other dancers were going in the summer, because like everyone wasn't there. And then I learned that they go to summer intensives to get picked up by these companies. So
Mhm.
they were learning this kind of capital, and then dealing with, things like that, or trying to figure out how they're funding. Some people, their parents funded them and supported them. Some people had to work. So I'm kind of talking about the differences in the dancers in this coming article. And
Okay.
so that's like the biggest thing. And then, of course, I'm working on my dissertation, which will encompass all of this good stuff. And then I also am working on a book chapter, which talks about the history of ballet, but focusing a lot on the Black experience that was taking place.
Okay. And the title of the dissertation is what?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm still kind of working on
Okay.
it.
No rush. No rush. But it's coming out. And so I want people to check out or Google and go to those library search databases and find the articles that already exist. I saw that your master's thesis, Black Swan, I think, is
Yes.
that's something that people can find already. And this article, obviously, and upcoming, there'll be more from Sekani Robinson, who will be Dr. Robinson soon. And where can people find you? Is there anywhere people can find you on your in terms of social media or
Yeah,
anything like that?
so I am on Instagram, and actually on there I'll post a lot of Black history and ballet. So my Instagram is Sekani R, and yeah, that's like the main platform that I use. I'm also on Twitter, so you can find me on Twitter. Same at. So those are the places I am.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your research and hope to have you back when the dissertation is finished or when this new article comes out, actually, just to highlight that as well. was an excellent article, and I think a resource that parents can use to prepare and support their children who want to become Black ballerinas, to not only know what to expect, but to have the internal resources and the network of persons around them to be able to flourish as Black ballerinas. Please check out this article, and we will see you next time for another segment of Affirmation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.